Buy with Rob is your best choice when purchasing your new home in the Puget Sound area. Call 360-710-9425 today and get started on the best home buying experience you will ever have. Go to buywithrob.com today.
He that commits a cruel act voluntarily is guilty of malice aforethought. And malice was very much on these prisoners' minds. By the very act of loading their muskets with powder and ball, they have proved this. They stand condemned by their own actions. I ask that you heed the words of the indictment, that the accused, not having the fear of God before their eyes, but being moved by the instigation of their own wicked hearts, did perpetrate nothing less than murder. You must pronounce them guilty.
I am for the prisoners at the bar. In the words of the Marquis of Beccaria, if by supporting the rights of mankind, I shall save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessings will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind.
Hey, this is YD from the Hail Evangelist Show, and you're listening to the Podcast 99 Internet Radio Network.
Hey, did I tell you guys I got a goat?
I know the racial divide that exists here. I know how hard it's been for our city and our nation to come together. And I also know the disparities, and I know the history. This announcement today recognizes that Empire actor Jussie Smollett took advantage of the pain and anger of racism to promote his career. I'm left hanging my head and asking why. Why would anyone, especially an African-American man, use the symbolism of a noose to make false accusations?
Why, he asked. Why would anyone do that? Chicago police laying out what they believe to be the motive in this case based on the two individuals.
Little column A, little column B.
Yeah, baby! Yeah.
Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you do. A lot of things happening in the world today. Most of them are far beyond our control, you might say. So perhaps it's time we can pause. All about life, all about the laws of gravity, the Constitution, the Sixth Amendment, Chicago, hate crime, politics, and more the news. Don't touch that dial, just try to hear me out for a while. Well, unless you live under a rock, the whole Jussie Smollett story has overwhelmed your news feeds. We watched as the Chicago police held their presser, and we've listened to pundits far and wide weigh in. What we haven't done is put on our thinking caps and asked ourselves questions like, what the heck is wrong with us? What else is doing, right? Here's how you get a hold of me. The text machine is area code 209-565-DAVE. That's 209-565-3283. The email is dave@thedavebowmanshow.com. And of course, we're on the web. Just look for The Dave Bowman Show on Facebook, Twitter, iTunes, whatever preferred non-denominational web search browser you use will take you to thedavebowmanshow.com. Ego Biberi Capulus et Molly Biberi. I drink coffee that others might live. Well, welcome to the new studio. So, we have spent quite a bit of time working on this and trying to get everything ready and trying to get everything working. And we've got half of it working. The other half, not so much. As you can see there, we've got some issues with that one. It's I'm not sure what the heck is going on there. It is acting a tad bit weird. And I don't know. This stuff is so temperamental that as the sun, we've got a big window over here. So as the sun goes down, it changes lighting conditions and things change. And we're still working on perfecting it, but we're getting closer. And I'm having a good time. Ben's having a good time with it. I like it because, again, it can make it more visually interesting and it can make it more entertaining for you, the listener, as you watch what's going on. So I'm glad you're If you like it, great. If you don't, well, just listen to the podcast. It's also available at thedavebowmanshow.com, as well as on iTunes and various and sundry other places. Well, like I said, unless you've been under a rock, you can't possibly have missed this Jussie Smollett story. It's kind of a weird thing. I was actually talking to Brian about this on Sunday, Brian Brody, and we were talking about what we knew about it, what we understood about it, and I was mentioning to him, I'd never heard of Jussie Smollett. Now, I've never watched a single minute of Empire, but then I'm not the target audience of it. So it's easy to say, well, I wouldn't watch it anyway, but it's like Nike shoes. They're not marketed to me. Empire is marketed to people who are not, conservative, white, cisgender, gun-loving men. It's not a show that would interest us. It's not marketed that way. I'd never seen a minute of it, and I'd never even heard of this guy until I was sitting here because I watch, I do watch TV when I'm in here, and TBS runs ads for stuff, and two of my favorite shows are on TBS. I don't know if you knew that or not. They run replays of The Big Bang Theory, which I'm sure you'll give me crap for liking, but they also run a show called The Detour, which I just think is some of the most brilliant television I've ever seen. I mean, it's funny, it's entertaining, it's poignant, and I enjoy it. And so I tend to watch a lot of TBS. Well, they run ads for a show that they have that is also not marketed to people like me called Drop the Mic. And it's a show about rap battles where people chat back and forth, rap back and forth and insult each other. I guess the premise is there. I don't, it's not something I would ever watch. And probably 3-4 weeks ago, before everything happened, there was a commercial for that show with him on it. Apparently somebody was insulting him because he's Terrence Howard's child and can't shimmy or shake or something like that. And the only reason I knew who he was when the news story first broke was because of that commercial. I'd seen that commercial and I thought, oh, that's that guy from Empire on Drop the Mic. Well, come to find out, of course, he's a star on Empire. He is not the star of Empire. I did read, the synopsis of the show and the plot lines and stuff like that. And as it turned out, the second thing I heard about him was a rumor that he was being essentially written out of the show, that his character was being phased out. I didn't pay much attention to that, and for the life of me, I can't find the link to it now because it was one of those links that I just, during the snowstorm, I just sort of blew by. And, well, I do know that the producer of Empire was asked at one point, would the attack on Jussie Smollett be a plot line in the story of Empire? And she said no, it would not be. Well, like most of us, we watched what happened. And I could sit here and we could talk about, what happened and why it happened and all of that kind of stuff. And I completely forgot to, I got talking and I forgot to change the thing there, right? So now we have Chicago behind us and Smollet right here my head. We could spend a lot of time talking about the details of what happened and why. And boy, I'll tell you, if you listened to the presser this afternoon after the arraignment, where the state basically read their list of charges that they read in court, so it was open record by that point. And boy, it was a detailed, assuming that the state has its ducks in a row, there ain't going to be much of a defense, except that we've kind of given them a defense. And so there's some issues with that we're going to talk about here in just a moment. But this whole story has been crazy because, even back at the beginning, media outlets were all outraged. Politicians were outraged. People were looking at each other going, well, what do you think about that? Do you condemn this? Well, duh, of course I condemn that kind of behavior. But from the word go on this story, literally hours after it first broke, there were questions that made people uncomfortable, particularly people who have experience with law enforcement and investigations and that sort of thing, where they were looking at it going, something's not right here. And they weren't shy about saying that. Something's not right here. And of course, they were shot down as, well, you're anti-gay or you're anti-black or you're anti-Chicago or whatever. And that was very uncomfortable to me. The idea that we can't have a question about something without being anti-something is problematic to me. You can't have an opinion that varies from the politically correct position without being labeled as something. If I've got a question about global warming, I'm told that I am a global warming denier. And therefore, in some people's opinions, and we've seen these online, you should be killed. If I disagree with some element of faith of someone, I'm told that I'm a heretic and I should be burned at the stake. If I'm a tennis star and I say that it's unfair to have men who are pretending to be women compete in women's sports, I get ostracized by the LGBTQ community, which I'm part of. Martina Navratilova has had that happen to her. Or if I'm a conservative and I say on Twitter, men are not women and women are not men, I get banned. These things are happening. We can't have rational conversations about facts. It is a fact, folks. A man is not a woman. You cannot change your gender. It cannot be done. And someone is going to report me for hate speech for saying that. But it is a scientific fact. It is undeniable. But in today's world, that will create havoc. It will create arguments. It will create anger. It's hate speech, don't you know? And by doing that, well, Trump is encouraging this because he's making it easier for people to come forward and feel comfortable in their skin saying hate speech. Dude, they were saying it long before there was a Donald Trump. They were saying these kinds of things. You ever read the Protocol of the Elders of Zion? I mean, let's get over ourselves here and let's start having rational, reasonable conversations about things as opposed to just, this whole nonsense about, well, everything's bad, everything's this, everything's that. It's not. And yet somehow or another, we continue to say to ourselves, well, it must be because otherwise I don't have any basis for it. And of course, there are people now that are arguing about why he did this and why Smollet did this. I think for me, especially on a Thursday, a Constitution Thursday, and I know I told you I wasn't going to be here at all this week, but here I am on a Constitution Thursday. I think for me, at the end of the day, watching what happened, especially this morning, prior to the arraignment, prior to any of that happening, the superintendent of police of Chicago, what's that guy's name, Eddie Johnson, trundled out in front of the cameras and held a press conference at which he lambasted Mr. Smollet. Remember this? I mean, it was unusual. It was universally praised. I heard Rush Limbaugh this morning. I just happened to be in the truck traveling when he was talking about it, talking about how wonderful it was to hear someone stand up for government institutions, to hear someone stand up and say the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing. And I thought to myself, and I actually sent a couple of texts this morning to two of my friends, Pat the lawyer and Brian, about this. I was appalled by that. I was absolutely appalled by what I was watching happening. Why? Well, what if that had been you? What if that had been you being accused of a crime? And it was the chief of police, wherever you happen to live, before you were even arraigned. You turned yourself in. You were getting your mugs. They didn't even have his mug shot yet. He hadn't been arraigned in court. And the chief of police, the sheriff, the local district attorney, whatever, was standing out in front of the cameras being broadcast nationwide, worldwide, for God's sake, telling everybody that what you did was bad, wrong. He was personally offended and appalled by it, mad, and boy, were there going to be consequences for this. Did no one else have a problem with that? Did no one else have an issue with the fact that before he had even been arraigned, they were doing this? I don't misunderstand me. I'm not defending what Jussie Smollett has allegedly done. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that, well, there's a proverb. The first to present his case seems right until another comes forward to question him. And a grand jury, as we've talked on numerous occasions, can indict a ham sandwich if it wants to. There's no possibility of exculpatory evidence, no excuses, no arguments, nothing. Okay, we've indicted him. We've issued an arrest warrant for him. He turned himself in. He hasn't been arraigned yet. The court hasn't even heard his plea yet. And we got a government official standing out front of the court, wherever the hell he was, with a microphone, broadcasting to the entire world. The entire world that this guy has been, I mean, for all practical purposes, the police indicted him, arrested him, arraigned him, tried him, judged him, and all but sentenced him in a 20-minute press conference before he'd been arraigned. And I got to be honest with you, it caused me some concern. It caused me a lot of concern. There's a lot of conversational buffalo meat on this whole thing. I want to talk about this at some point. We don't have time today. Alyssa Milano, who used to be famous, tweeted, if that man staged his own attacks, he is wrong in so many ways. No one could be that hurtful to stage this, right? To bleep with us all by playing into our weaknesses and making it even harder for victims. There is so much about what's wrong with this whole thing right there. Our weaknesses, the fact that she can't believe that is strange to me. But she's an actress too. She knows this. We're dealing with actors and actresses here. We're dealing with people who make their living pretending to be something they are not. Right? Why are we surprised? Putting all that aside, putting all the motivations aside, whether he was mentally ill, whether he was, upset about his salary, whether he was defending himself, whatever, it doesn't matter to me. Well, none of that matters to me. What matters to me is that a man was accused of something, and before the process could take its place, the process that we say we value so much, the government had essentially already convinced you of everything you needed to know. I just don't think that's the way we do things here. In 1773, we're all familiar with the Boston Massacre and the fact that these British soldiers, these Lobster Backs, went out into the street and murdered these American patriots, these Colonials, these people who were simply defending their way of life. That's all it was, right? And the Colonials put them on trial, did everything they could to convict them. I mean, they loaded their muskets, didn't they? If they loaded their muskets, they must be guilty. They must be. You must return an indictment of murder because malice aforethought. They loaded those muskets. Therefore, they meant to kill someone. And they went out into the streets and they gunned down these Americans. And in one of the most spectacular trials, and it was actually two trials, these men were put on trial in Boston in that time frame. And their defense attorney was a guy by the name of John Adams. Yes, that John Adams. The man who would go on to become one of the leading patriots in the cause and eventually become a president of the United States. That John Adams was these men's defense attorneys. And his general argument was such that you don't know, you weren't there. I mean, what we had here was a situation where a mob was sent out into the streets. And the mob was doing bad things. And the soldiers, whatever you might think of the process of assigning them to do so, were sent to keep the peace. Now, again, Adams made it clear he did not think soldiers should be keeping the peace. He was very clear about that, and he was very impassioned about that. In fact, one of the things he said was, soldiers, when quartered in a populous town, will always occasion two mobs where they prevent one. You'll always, anytime you try to break up one mob, you're going to end up with two, because now you're going to end up with people that are mad at the police and mad at this and whatever. And of course, that's what happened. And as we looked on and as we began to study these things, what we discovered was that there were people in that crowd surrounding the soldiers yelling, "Fire! Fire!" Well, what's a soldier supposed to do when he hears the command to fire? Adams asked, quite logically. They fired. They believed that they were instructed to do so. They didn't know that a building a couple blocks away was on fire. They had no way of knowing this. And so Adams makes that point. He makes the point about, I'm going to defend people that are unpopular. I'm going to defend people against ignorance and tyranny. Ignorance and tyranny. And if in doing so, I save one person's life, then that's good enough for me. I'm not worried about it. He was quoting the Marquis, what's his name? But the point being that he understood that there was a great injustice being done here. Now, again, for all I know, and Smollet, I don't know if he did it or not. I get common sense. I'm not arguing that. But I am arguing that even a man who stands accused of doing the things that Jussie Smollett did is entitled to the rights of the accused. That's a scene right out of A Few Good Men. Remember Jack Nicholson goes crazy, "I'm going to rip your skull off," and the judge is banging his gavel and he says, "MPs, guard the colonel." And Kevin Bacon's character says, "The accused has rights." And they do. And some of those rights that they have are so precious to us that we say this, I don't know if we believe it or not, but we say that we would rather let a guilty man go than convict an innocent man. That's how important these rights are to us. That's what we say. But then we have this Sixth Amendment, which says very simply, in all criminal prosecutions, and keep in mind, the Smollet thing is a criminal prosecution, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and shall be informed of the cause and nature of the cause of the accusation that happened, to be confronted with witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for retaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. I'm pretty sure that Smollet will have no problem hiring a reasonably competent defense attorney. What I am concerned about is the approach to this whole thing, which has been very public. Before Jussie Smollett, whatever his name is, it was arraigned. Before he was even literally in the system. The Chicago police were in front of worldwide cameras. Again, indicting him, arraigning him, trying him, judging him, and basically threatening to sentence him. Now, in a story this big, how likely is it that you can find an impartial jury in the state and district wherein Mr. Smollet now stands accused of the crimes that he is accused of? Especially given the fact that it's all over the news. CNN would later on, after the arraignment, broadcast the district attorney's reading of the indictment, and that's fine because once he's arraigned, that becomes public record. But again, it's an indictment. It's not a guilty verdict. We believe that this is what he did, and we believe that the evidence will. That's what it starts with. We believe that the evidence will show this. Because the prosecution should have to lay out its entire case, speedy and public. They don't have years to investigate things, and they have to do it publicly so that they're not ramrodding people through, so that they're not hiding things, they're not, investigating people, because you investigate anybody long enough, you're going to find something, is the general attitude, and the government is prevented from doing that. They can't do that. That's not our way of doing things. You know what I'm saying? We don't practice that. We don't do that. And yet, here we are in this case. Again, very high profile. I get the issues that are involved here. I get believe it or not, I understand the passion with which that policeman stood up there and asked that question, why? Because they need to know why. They need an answer to that. And if the answer to that is, I was mad about my salary, then there are people that I have known all my life who marched for civil rights, who have battled those things, who have worked hard to give the coming generations the opportunities that they didn't have, who are going to be rightfully infuriated. But they should be equally as infuriated if a man is convicted of these things before he's even freaking arraigned. We either have a criminal justice system, we either have the Sixth Amendment rights that lay there, that inform us of how the government can do these things, or the government can just come out and say, you did this, and that's the way it's going to be. Are you going to find an impartial jury in this case? Who knows? I don't. For all I know, Smollett's, for all I know, he's going to come down to a plea agreement. Who knows what he will ultimately decide to do? My concern is what happens the next time when it's not some famous actor or important soldiers or anything like that. What happens the next time when it's you or me or Ted or Pat or KK or whoever? What happens then? What happens when the government is holding press conferences before we're even arraigned, explaining to the potential jury who might be listening, probably would be, depending on the infamous quality of your crime, why they think you ought to be strung up by your gonads? They don't understand how you could do this and how you wanted it, why you would do this. They don't understand. Is it too much to ask that professional police officers, people who have sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States, it's in their oath, professional prosecutors who have sworn an oath to uphold and defend the prosecution, the government, be held to the standards that we said they should be held to? Was it really going to make that much difference to you or to me to have the police come out there and give us their case before he'd even been arraigned, or to just come out and say, Mr. Smollet has turned himself in, we're processing him through the system, he'll be arraigned at 1 p.m. Central Time. You'll hear the case then. You'll hear the charges then. Would that have been so hard? But because we have associated this stuff with so much of our culture now, we feel like we have to know everything. And we don't. We didn't need to know that. And more importantly, a savvy defense attorney could very well use that against the state in this whole thing. How can I get a fair trial in this? How in the world can I possibly get a fair trial now? Having this man stand out there and do this. We've talked about this before with the president tweeting about things. How can Bo Bergdahl possibly get a fair trial when the commander and freaking chief is tweeting about the case? You can't. And you can't rationalize it that he can. Jussie Smollett had not even been arraigned when the Chicago police were delivering their, whatever you want to call that. And while you might agree with him, while I might agree with him, while what he said might have been eloquent and brilliant, it doesn't change the fact that the accused have rights. And that when we violate those rights of the accused, we're every bit as wrong as he might have been, allegedly. We don't know if he really was yet or not. But when we crap all over those rights, when we take those rights and go, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to pay any attention to that. We're every bit as guilty of violating our beliefs, our Constitution, our process, as someone who stands accused of a crime. That may not make me popular. I don't really care. I don't really care if you agree with me or not. I really don't. I know that once upon a time, John Adams stood up and defended men who were indefensible, men who our nation would have been just as glad to see hanged as they would have been otherwise. And yet he believes so firmly that our ideas of justice and the rights of the accused were so important that because it was tyranny, folks. It's tyranny. It's evil for the government to do that. You understand that? And I don't, you can't slice it any other way. That police chief is the government. He is the government. End of story. And the government did what they did. I got to get right. Take the time right now. Tell the people that matter in your life you love them very much. You'd miss them if they weren't there, so don't pass up those opportunities. You don't want to have that regret. Plausibly Live, I'm Dave Bowman. This is my show, The Dave Bowman Show, right here on the Podcast 99 Internet Radio Network. We'll see you next week, probably. We'll talk about that at some point, I'm sure. But we'll be back soon on The Dave Bowman Show. Thanks for listening.
The Dave Bowman Show is a Slippery Fish Entertainment production for the Podcast 99 Internet Radio Network. For more information or to complain about how the show offended you, the text or voicemail number is 209-565-DAVE. For more information about the show, log on to thedavebowmanshow.com.
Hey, I'm going to go do something productive. I'm going to go watch television.